Hello everyone. Welcome back. We've hit the new record today. This is the smallest class, in-person class we have. We have only 4 people. It's a very intimate session we have. So like you can ask all sorts of crazy questions. We'll still be recorded, so keep that in mind. There's even some people who've always attended classes have also broken their record this time. I forgot their name, but so anyway, okay, get let's just get started. Since it's a pretty small group today, we can be a bit more relaxed and chill. Um, okay, we left off last week with Indonesia Menggugat, right? Sukarno's landmark political text. And again, we'll be covering this again next week. We've sort of been going back and forth between the text and sort of Indonesia's own history, since the text itself is again structured like as sort of a sort of a biography of Indonesia itself. Last week we talked about old imperialism, the system of the VOC when the Dutch East India Company ruled over parts of modern Indonesia. Today we're going to see how this evolves and how this develops into what Sukarno calls modern new imperialism. And so this is sort of a nice recap, more or less, of what we're going to cover today. The VOC eventually died in the 1800s, and then you have this sort of tempestuous period in Europe. You have the French Revolution and some other stuff, and then eventually we're going to go into the system called Kulturstelsel, and we'll talk more about that. And then eventually we'll transition to modern new imperialism. So let's start off with what was happening in Europe at the dawn of the 19th century. I don't know if all of you attended, but on Saturday we had a session with Peter Carey, and he talked a lot about this. And this was a very explosive period of history. If you sort of look at history books, this is often bookmarked as the beginning of modern history. And so you had 2 revolutions happening in Europe at the dawn of the 19th century. The first was this massive explosion. It was the French Revolution, right? And I'm not sure what everyone's sort of experiences with the French Revolution is from history class, but this is sort of we were just mentioning how you broke your record, but you still maintained it. Welcome back. Um, it's not turns out to not be small. So like censor yourself. Don't be very honest with your question. So right, the French Revolution. This was again, it's hard to overstate how big of an explosion, how big of a break this was in terms of politics, but also in terms of culture and philosophy. And thinkers of the period saw it as such. This was the moment. This was what gave birth to sort of the modern era. Hegel, the German philosopher, he sort of was watching as Napoleon was passing by his hometown of Jena after the Battle of Jena, Auerstedt. And Hegel is like, this is it. This world soul passing by me is heralding sort of the coming of a new age. And what was so revolutionary about this? Politically, again, it sort of heralded sort of this, it was this violent overthrow of an ancient monarchic system in France. And it spread these ideas, again, the credo of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, these ideas sort of fueled by the Enlightenment became sort of the bedrock and of a growing political tide in Europe. And so that was the explosion of the French Revolution. There was another revolution taking place at the same time. This one slower, more steady, more gradual, but in many ways equally, if not more impactful. And that was the Industrial Revolution. It started with small things. Communal land in the English countryside being marked out, being enclosed for private ownership. The invention of a new textile spinning machine, the discovery of the steam engine, all of these built up slowly. And again, we live with the consequences today, right? We live in a fossil fuel economy. We have smartphones, we have steel, we have concrete everywhere. We live in sort of the debris of the Industrial Revolution. And so all of this was taking place in Europe, but they eventually made their way to Indonesian shores. And again, what was the transmitter of this? It was the European powers. So let's sort of cover a bit of this. And so again, remember, the French Revolution broke out and then it sort of transitioned to the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon takes power in France and sort of ends up conquering vast swaths of Europe. The Netherlands was sort of one of the territories that was conquered by revolutionary France. And eventually the VOC goes bankrupt, it's taken over by the Dutch government. And we sort of begin with this guy, Herman Dendels, and Indonesians will sort of know him. He's kind of an infamous figure. And he's sort of one of these first big figures that come with this enlightenment, this post-French Revolution mindset, and he tries to apply it to the Dutch East Indies. And the way he does it is by this sort of rationalization of the administrative system. And again, what is the essence of the Enlightenment? One of them was this idea that humans are, inherently rational, and reason is sort of this peak, this pinnacle of human existence. It's not a new idea, but the Enlightenment really like doubled down on that. And this applied to its society. There was this idea that like efficient government, modern government is rational, it's structured. You have a clear bureaucracy. This was sort of one of the, again, Napoleon is a strange figure because he rises to power on the backs of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, but he's an emperor. He's not sort of a republican leader by any means, but he sort of very enthusiastically imbibes these Enlightenment ideas of rational, ordered, modern government. And Dendels tries to bring that essentially to the Dutch East Indies, especially Java. Again, Professor Carey talked a bit about this as well, and how this eventually sparked a backlash in the form of the Java War. But I won't go too much into Dendels. For our purposes today, we'll focus a bit more on the English interregnum in the 1811s and 14s, 1811 to 14, where again, remember, the Napoleonic War is brewing in Europe, and Napoleonic France was fighting all this coalition of powers, foremost amongst them England. And so again, the Dutch East Indies was a French protectorate. And so if you're English, you're like, I want to conquer this. I want to sort of break French power. And that's sort of what happens. The English invade and take over the Dutch East Indies, and this period called the English Interregnum by Stanford Raffles. Again, we'll talk more about that. Eventually, Fort is eventually returned to Dutch rule. And the other thing I want to highlight is that, again, massive wars in Europe at the time. Wars are really, really expensive. And so what's in everyone's mind at this time? How do I pay back? How do I sort of reimburse all of the war funds that I spent? And that sort of sets the stage for what we're going to be talking about today. So I have this graph of coffee and sugar prices. And these aren't real prices. These are just indexes. So they just show the movement of the prices. These aren't the actual prices. I tried to look for data stretching to the 1800s. I couldn't find any reliable ones. So we start at the 1850s. But the picture is the same. You have a boom in coffee and sugar prices. Why? Because these are becoming the new mass consumer goods in Europe. Think of an institution starts popping up all over the place in the 18th and 19th century. Coffee houses, cafes. It's linked to the French Revolution. There's some really good studies on how cafes and coffee houses become these third spaces where intellectuals and political leaders would just freely meet and mingle. And that sort of like played a role in facilitating the spread of ideas. The coffee and the sugar has to come from somewhere. And again, throw back the cloves, throw back the nutmegs. This is our starting point. But also notice how this sort of mirrors an evolution in the global capitalist economy. Last week, we started with exotic goods, manuka honey, right? Remember, nutmeg, cloves. Now we're going to mass consumer goods. People, not just the ultra rich who are trying to find an exotic medicinal fix. People, everyday consumers are consuming these things. And so this sort of aligns with sort of the development of modern capitalism as well. And so let's turn to Raffles and the English interregnum. Raffles is he's sort of the governor general of the English Empire in Southeast Asia. At the time, he's also known as like the founder of modern Singapore. That's why you have a lot of Raffles stuff, Raffles Hotel, Raffles, etc., in Singapore. He also sort of presided over English rule in the Dutch East Indies and especially Java. at this time. And Raffles was faced with the same question that Daendels and later Dutch administrators would face, which is, how do we turn a profit, right? How do we pay back all of the financial damages caused by the wars in Europe? And this is the answer. This is part of the answer. You want to capitalize on the boom, on the prices of coffee and sugar. And coffee and sugar are tropical crops. And so it's hard to grow them outside of the equatorial belt. And so Raffles and the English basically try to transform Java into a region for the production of these crops. But what's interesting about Raffles is the way he went about it. Again, what's the backdrop? The French Revolution, the Enlightenment. There were these ideas of modern administration, modern economics. Let's start with modern administration. And we kind of alluded to this with Daendels. During the Dutch system, during the VOC, sorry, and we spoke about this a bit last week. Remember, they had a forced delivery system, right? Again, you had all of these bupatis, all of these local elites who were sort of like kind of under you. You didn't really control their land. They weren't even necessarily under you, but you had sort of these agreements where you're like, okay, every year you are forced to deliver several tons of rice to me, forced deliveries. Raffles kind of streamlines this. He says, okay, that land actually belongs to the Dutch government. And so it's not like that's your land and I'm asking you to give me stuff. I'm asking you to give me tribute. That's not what they're doing anymore. I actually own the land as a government, and you're entitled to pay me a rent, a land tax. And again, that sounds familiar to us today, right? Yeah. We all pay land tax. Well, we're not, if you're a property owner, I guess most of us aren't. So there's this idea that like we want to streamline administration. This is modern, right? Because you have a modern bureaucracy. There's none of these weird like, oh, I'm your lord, and because you have this feudal obligation to give me part of your produce. There's none of that. It's I own the land, I lease it to you, and so you pay a land rent. The economics part is also interesting because again, remember, under the VOC system, it's forced deliveries. You're forced to, you have an obligation to send me a portion of your output, of your product. Raffles sort of comes into play with the sort of the ideas of classical liberal economics that was brewing at the time. And again, it dovetails with these Enlightenment ideas of rationality, where it's sort of, you can leave, and that's what laissez-faire means. Laissez-faire means leave them to do what they want. If I leave the Javanese peasantry to do whatever they want, they're going to produce the most profitable crops, coffee and sugar, because that's how much they're going to earn. That's sort of the idea. And so you sort of have this interesting feedback loop. If you're a Javanese peasant, you have to pay the government rent, usually in cash. How do you earn the cash? By selling these crops on the world market. And so you have this sort of virtuous cycle. And there's sort of this belief that, like, again, it's very Enlightenment coded. Again, you don't have to go too much into this. We'll talk about it in the third module in greater depth. But sort of the idea is that we can let people do what they want. We can let the Javanese do what they want, and they'll get rich, and they'll also make us rich. It didn't work out. Sort of none of the export targets were met. None of the production targets were met. Coffee and sugar production remained abysmal. And so why did this not happen? Right? If you think about it, it violates this paradigm almost that like you let people do what they want and they'll produce the most profitable crops, everyone's going to be happy. That didn't happen. Why didn't that happen? And to understand that, we're going to turn to this Hungarian anthropologist, Karl Polanyi. And he wrote this book, The Great Transformation, 1944. And again, 1944, this guy's been through a lot. World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. This is sort of like the sense that why is the world breaking? Why is the world coming apart? And he writes this book to try to understand that from the lens of anthropology and economic history. And his answer lies in this concept called market society. What is market society? So, so let's start with the world we live in, a world governed by market economics, or as Polanyi would say, market society. Now, in the way I'm going to be talking about economics for the rest of this class, it sort of refers to the fact that we have material needs. We need to eat food. We need to drink water. We need to build houses we can live in. We need to wear clothes. Someone has to produce them. Someone has to, and we have to distribute them a certain way. That's what I mean by economics. Market economics just means that we do all of that through the mechanism of prices and profit through a market. So I have a labubu right here, and it's sort of I chose the labubu because I think it's so senseless that it captures the point perfectly. And so I hope I didn't shit on any labubu fans today. I'm sorry. I'm sort of outing myself here. So what goes inside the head of a guy or a lady who sort of gets this idea that I want to produce this stuff? It's profit, right? If you can imagine that if you produce enough of this little brown cretin and you can make enough money, you're going to produce it. That's from the producer side. What about the consumer? You'll buy it if the price makes sense. Not that it's cheap enough, but that it makes sense. Why? This isn't cheap. This is $300. It can go up to $300. A labubu. Yeah. This again makes sense. And it doesn't make sense to some people, but it makes sense to a lot of people. To the labubu market, it makes sense, right? $200 makes sense. And so for some, so if you're a consumer, what governs why you buy something? It's worth the money. There's some utility you have or whatever, and it's like it's worth the money. So you buy it. And it's the intersection, again, I don't know if there are any economics students here. That's sort of like what you get with the classical supply demand curve, right? Where they meet is where producer motives of is it profitable enough interacts with consumer, does the price make sense? And that's sort of market economics. It's governed by these very price and value-based decisions. Producers based on profit calculations, consumers based on like, does it make sense for me to buy this? Now, there's an important predicate of this, which is that the things that you want to subject to a market have to be commodifiable. What do I mean by commodifiable? You have to be able to buy and sell it. But to be able to buy and sell something, it needs to have it needs to have a price. It needs to have a value. You have to be able to put a number on it. Or even at least this sense of like, I want to exchange a water bottle with a piece of chalk. This water bottle is worth how many pieces of chalk? There has to be this sort of sense of commensurability, right? And that sort of gets the value. And there are different kinds of value theory in economics. Like the classical economists, all the way from Smith to Marx, think it's embedded in labor. Value reflects labor. Marginalists, and most modern economists are kind of marginalists. They think it's based on utility. Value is based on like how much every person's subjective sense of how much they want, how much they can get from the item. But you need some kind of value theory. You have to be able to put a kind of number, a kind of value on things. And that's why labubu is such a perfect example. It does not make sense why it's $300, but somehow the market, this interaction between producer and consumer needs have conspired to make a labubu cost $300. Now, the other question we can ask is, can we commodify everything, right? Can we commodify children? Can we commodify life? I mean, we try to do it with life insurance, right? Can we commodify nature? Can we put a price on nature? Keep this question at the back of your heads. Can we commodify everything? So that's the world we live in, and this feels very familiar with us, to us, I think. I hope so. Well, Polanyi argues that this wasn't always the case. You have a lot of societies before the emergence and the spread of modern capitalism that did economics, that sort of engage with this question of production and distribution without recourse to prices, without recourse to the profit incentive, without recourse to utility maximization. So I have this very this is a messy chart, but like let's sort of go through it slowly. Polanyi uses the example of the Trobriand Islands. These were located in the Pacific Islands, are located in the Pacific Islands. And so let's start with this protagonist family. You have a family in the Trobriand Islands, and they're, for the most part, say self-sufficient. They produce enough to feed themselves. That would be a simple system, right? Sort of an autarky, everyone for themselves. But that didn't turn out to be the case. Turns out that this social organization is more complex than we first thought. So for starters, there's a bit of a community social safety net. And Polanyi observed that there was sort of this pattern of reciprocal obligation where matrilineal relatives were obligated to basically support their families. For example, protagonist's family, right? The wife of the protagonist's family, all the relatives of the wife has to donate some part of their produce to this family. And the sort of, again, the husband's sister or mother, and that's the matrilineal line, has to do the same, right? So you're obligated to donate everyone in your matrilineal relative line. Again, that's sort of like an example of cooperation, right? Where you're sort of like, okay, I have to provide for other people. Although in this very specific sense, that's determined by a matrilineal relation. Now, the interesting thing is that this wasn't governed by profit. It's not profitable for you to donate some of your proceeds to your sister, to your mother, right? There's no profit motive at all here. What was the glue? What powered this? It was purely social relations. The sense that, like, if I don't do that, people are going to shame me. They're going to think I'm a bad person. What's the analogy? Your family, maybe you have like a sister and brother-in-law. You don't really like him. You don't really like her. But then they host like a family dinner. You still have to, it's sort of recommended to still attend the family dinner, because otherwise then they'll start gossiping about you. Like, why is this person not being a good son or daughter or whatever? And that's sort of the idea. You can engineer sort of systems of distribution and production without having to rely on sort of profit motives. Another one, if that didn't make sense, this one's even more explicit. This is sort of like closer to like what you think of as like social safety. All the families in the Trobriand Islands are sort of obligated to sort of donate some of their produce to the tribal chief. And the tribal chief pools all of these resources. And then in certain periods, he basically distributes them to society. And the way they do it is through big public events like feasts and ceremonies. There's a really good study. I don't remember who's the author, essentially, who says that selamatan in certain Indonesian regions, sort of like these big feasts that are thrown, basically are pre-modern, non-bureaucratic ways of distributing wealth. He even shows a similar example with trade. There's a chain of islands in the Trobrians called the Kula Ring. And so there's sort of this mechanism where, like, in every island on the Kula Ring, you sort of have like a pair on another island, sort of like a counterpart, and you're sort of obligated. It's almost like a ritual. You're sort of supposed to travel to this other island and exchange an object. So you get an object that you think might be like valuable, like maybe a trinket or like a bracelet, and then you go to this island and you exchange it for something of equal value with someone else. What does that do? This creates sort of this motion. People always move from one island to the next. It's trade, essentially, right? When person A moves to the island, the next island on the Kula Ring, well, he can bring all sorts of stuff with him, and then they can sort of exchange or whatever. Again, like it's the TLDR, the main lesson of this is that you can organize economics, you can organize production and distribution without recourse to the profit motive. Does that make sense? Because this is sort of a very important point. It's critical to understanding why raffles fail in Java. Yeah, it's kind of messy, but I hope, yeah, Again, any questions? Anyone want any clarifications? No? Okay, good. Okay. Similar, I don't know if there are any anthropologists here, but James Scott, he has this argument called moral economies. And it's basically a pretty good way of describing this. It's a moral economy. You achieve economic ends through non-economic moral ends. Another really good example is interest, charging interest. In both Christian and Islamic society, traditionally charging interest was considered a sin. Like in Christianity, it's called usury. In Islamic society, it's called riba. And again, you talk to a modern banker, they'll say this is dumb. This is, where's the profit in that? But again, we live in a society that was a society where moral economies dominated. It was completely appropriate for people in these societies to say, well, it makes sense to subordinate profit, to subordinate gain to higher moral ends, whatever that might be. And maybe if this feels alien to you, it's because we live in a world that's like this and not like this anymore. And so that's sort of where Polanyi comes in. He argues that this society, this Labubu society, had to be created. It did not arise organically. It arose historically at a certain point in history. It's quite coincidental that 1944, the year Polanyi would publish his book, Friedrich Hayek published The Road to Serfdom, which argued the complete opposite. Polanyi comes in and says that, okay, market society arises historically, and market society, spoiler alert, is damaging. And Hayek basically comes in and says, no, it's not. It's the best way of organizing societies. And that's sort of, this debate will feel familiar to us. Especially, again, I don't think the whole market versus non-market argument is that pronounced in Indonesia outside of economic circles, but it's very pronounced in the US. For the longest time, that was what distinguished a Democrat and a Republican. Like, how much of the market do you want to introduce into society? So Polanyi goes one step further. He says it's not just market economics, it's market society. You subordinate all of society to be organized by this logic. Hence, society. What does that require? Every decision you make has to be filtered to the lens of, is it profitable? Does this maximize the utility of certain people? What does this require? This requires everything to be commodified. That's the only way this market logic works. But again, remember what we said previously. Can you commodify everything? Polanyi's answer is no, you can't. And he outlines 3 commodities. He calls them fictitious commodities that are just resistant to the logic of commodification. The first is land. How do you even begin to put a price on land, right? Again, it's sort of, and sort of, for Polanyi, there's something artificial in this. There's something artificial in forcing land, forcing labor, and even money. He calls money a fictitious commodity to be commodified. Land is a great example. For most of human history, and he's speaking here specifically of England, land was sort of, a lot of village land was held communally. And sort of there was this like, sort of this part of communal land that everyone from the village could sort of draw on in periods of crisis. This was slowly dismantled over the course of the 16th to 18th centuries by something called the enclosure movement. So people would literally, usually it was farmers who wanted to convert the land into grass pastures for grazing sheep. They would literally enclose these pieces of land and say, this is mine, this is now private property. And once you do that, okay, you kind of, it becomes easier to turn land to a commodity, right? It's mine, it's now scarce, you can measure it, it belongs to just individual people, commodity. Same thing with labor. And Polanyi talks about this phenomenon called pauperization. And pauperization is not the same as poverty. A pauper isn't just a poor person. A pauper is a poor person who has no job and is dependent on government handouts. Notice how poverty is now linked to a lack of work and the fact that you need to turn to support. That's the phenomenon of pauperization. And really the big rise in pauperization in this period came from the enclosure movements in England. Like all of these farmers lost their land. What do? They go to the cities to look for jobs, usually to work in the factories. And there was this whole big debate in 19th century English classical economics about the role of the poor. Should we provide for the poor? And again, I want to stress how historic this is. For most of human history, at least in the line of thinking of people like Karl Polanyi, it was sort of obvious that sort of like the better off in society should provision for those who are less well off. And work wasn't even glorified as like something to aspire to. For example, Roman and Greek elites glorified leisure. And sort of their definition of like, why are we privileged? Why are we aristocrats? It's because we literally don't have to work. We don't have to like earn a living. This sort of changed with sort of, and that's this Weber's argument with the Protestant work ethic. And literally some of the debates that you'd see in this time is that, okay, we should not provide support for the poor because if we provide support for the poor, they will not work, right? And so work becomes something that's conditional almost on and money too is another fictitious commodity. And what's the example? Money markets. You go to a bank, you take out a loan. What is a loan? You buy money. What's the price? Interest, right? And so why was this necessary? For Polanyi, it was because as industry became more complex, as you had the Industrial Revolution, businessmen had to be able to like access land, labor, and money in a very easy and predictable way. Where does the prediction come from? From the commodification. You can track the prices. It's that simple. Again, Polanyi has a very negative view of this. Polanyi says first, he has this very famous quote, laissez-faire was planned. This did not emerge organically. You had to impose this framework. You had to impose this social system on societies, and it emerged historically. And again, based on everything I just said about land and labor, about the enclosures and pauperization, you can kind of already guess that Polanyi doesn't have a very positive view on this. I won't go, I've already rambled too long on this, but Polanyi essentially links the crises of the 20th century to this. Again, I'd be happy to talk about it more later, but I think I'm gonna stop for the moment. Needless to say, this also had a very damaging effect on these kinds of societies. And he has this very illustrative example of certain African tribes. He observed that in a lot of these African tribes who were, again, moral economies, they were organized around ritualistic warfare. And so if you're a young man from this African tribe, what was your milestone in life? I went on my first raid. I sort of became a kind of war chief. All of your entire value system, your entire cultural system, your entire way of life was predicated on this system. And that disappeared when colonialism entered the area. Because what do you need for markets? You need peace. You cannot have intermittent tribal warfare. And so Polanyi has this great line where he says, okay, these African natives might be better off than they were previously, but they are also dying from boredom. They don't understand this new world. This new world doesn't make sense to them. It feels off. The cultural dissonance is massive. And so that's Polanyi. And let's apply this framework. Let's apply Polanyi to Java. And once we do, we can sort of see why Raffles kind of failed. And the short answer is that there was no market society in Java. Java still functioned like this. And so when Raffles came in and tried to establish markets and tried to use price incentives, it just didn't work. Let me highlight a few interesting observations regarding this. There's one here on the moral economy. Again, if you're a Javanese peasant, labor obligations were based on what? Moral ties. Again, remember the Trobriand Islands, right? Reciprocity. I have an obligation to my neighbor, to my family, to my bupati, to my aristocrat. And that's what drove people to do what they do. It wasn't profit. And so when Raffles dangles the profit bait, produce sugar, it's profitable. No one took the bait. And again, markets are not necessary. Again, we take this for granted. Prices go up, prices go down. We're like, okay, oversupply, undersupply, over demand, under demand. Not people who haven't been socialized under the system don't necessarily understand. That's another factor. Fasseur makes this very interesting observation that in spite of what Raffles did, some villages kept producing rice. They didn't care that rice was not as profitable as coffee and sugar, because for them, the goal wasn't profit maximization. It was something else, it was some kind of other cultural or moral value system. And so that's why Raffles failed. Another important element, Java is one of the densest parts of the world today. It wasn't always the case. You see this massive population boom in the 19th centuries. When during this time, Java was much emptier. And so population density was very low compared to what it was today. What does this mean? It meant that labor was a more valuable resource than land. You had land, but you didn't have people to work the land. And so this gave labor more power over land. And that's part of the reason why this didn't work out as well, because the Dutch administration or the English administration would say, work this plantation. Oh, okay, that land's empty, I'll just move there. People could just vote with their feet, essentially. And that brings us to kulturstelsel. And it's sort of the literal translation of kulturstelsel is the cultivation or the culture system. In Indonesian, it's more ominous, tanam paksa, forced planting, forced cultivation. And that really gets at the heart of it, because kulturstelsel was a system of labor coercion. It was instituted in 1830. Again, remember, the financial pressures we were talking about, the drain from the Napoleonic Wars, that got worse because of the Java War, Perang Diponegoro. And so this pressure, we need to make the Dutch East Indies profitable. We need to make more money, was even more acute. And so in a world where you cannot coax Javanese peasants to produce sugar and coffee because it's profitable, how do you get them to do it? You force them. You force them. That was the genesis of kulturstelsel. And how did it work? It basically mandated that if you're a peasant, 20% of your land had to be allocated to cash crops. The big ones, sugar, coffee, and also indigo. How did, again, mandated, right? That's the key word. It's forced planting. It's forced cultivation. So how did it, one of the ways they did this, and again, remember, we talked about the VOC last week. We talked about how the VOC already started co-opting elites. The Dutch East Indies did the same thing. They basically, how do you weaponize moral economies? If the Javanese respond to sort of moral obligations to their bupati, what do? You co-opt the bupati. You tell the bupati, you get a portion of the spoils if you can get your peasants, you get the people under you to plant coffee and sugar. And that's essentially what happened. And this sort of like paved the way to insane amounts of corruption. Because again, it's at 20%, but if you're a bupati, you realize that, oh, if I can get the peasants under me to produce more, I'll send the 20% to the Dutch government, I'll keep the rest. I'll make me rich. And again, the peasants were compensated at very poor rates. So it was quite exploitative in that sense. And Robert Elson, writing in 1990, he estimates that this sort of force peasants to perform 4 to 5 times more labor. There are all sorts of reasons for this. For example, Javanese peasants still need to eat. You still need to grow rice. If you're spending 20% of your time growing sugar and coffee, that's not, like for example, you spend 5 hours a day growing rice. You still need to eat that rice. And then they're like, okay, add 2 more hours of coffee and sugar, 7 hours. You can't just swap those 2 hours of those 5 hours. You can't just grow less rice because then you'll stop. That was one way in which that sort of increased this. Agriculturally, it also became more complex because the land that you used to grow rice, now you have to use it to grow all these other crops. So like you have these more convoluted crop rotation techniques. And also, a lot of these peasants were forced to perform corvée labor for constructing infrastructure, like roads and canals, and that wasn't recorded at all. To make this a bit more visceral, I'm going to focus on something called the Priangan system. And the Priangan is a region in West Java. centered around Bandung today. It's a very hilly, it's a very mountainous region. And the Priangan system sort of was focused on growing coffee, which is the most profitable crop of Coulter stencil. And I want to focus on the Priangan because it's the most extreme. It's the most extreme version of the Coulter stencil. And so we can really see viscerally how this sort of like labor exploitation and coercion happened. And a lot of this had to do with coffee itself. Coffee is unique. Sugar, you can grow sugar on the same land that you grow rice. So again, if you're a peasant, okay, I have my rice field, I'll just convert 20% to grow sugar. Coffee grows well in hilly locations, higher up. So usually the place where you grow rice is different from the place where you grow coffee. What does that mean? If you're a peasant, you have to travel all the way to the mountains. You have to climb up the foothills to grow coffee. So you need some way to force peasants to move. And again, remember when we were talking about empty lands? The Priangan was sort of a frontier area at the time. It was quite empty. And this created the perfect storm. There's no labor in this area. It's completely empty, but you need to move people. You have to forcefully move people here, away from their villages, away from their rice paddies to grow coffee. And this created very ripe conditions for extreme labor coercion. I have here sort of like a statistic from Bremen, the guy who wrote about the Priangan system. So these are sort of places where you can grow coffee under the system. Hedgerow and forest here. So hedgerows are so usually the peasant in his village can also sort of grow coffee where they can fit it in their sawah. That's hedgerow. And then forest is sort of like the immediates. They clear out they cut down some trees and then they grow there. But the main point is that forage and hedgerows are like coffee cultivation that's immediately around the peasant village. They don't have to move that far. Plantations, on the other hand, are dedicated sites solely for growing coffee, and they're usually like far up in the mountains and hills. And we see how over time, how increasing, yeah, it's plantation sort of coffee cultivation sort of dominates all of this. And Bremen's, I put some quotes here that sort of highlights the dynamic here. Part of the reason why plantations were favored was because the Dutch just needed so much coffee. They needed so much coffee. What does that mean? You need more land. And when you don't have enough land around the village, what do? You clear out land in the plant for plantations. Again, you want to max, you're min-maxing. You want to optimize coffee growth, coffee cultivation. There's another reason why they did this. It's easier to monitor labor in the plantations. And I have this sort of line here from Bremen. Fences were built around the gardens to keep the peasants in so that they could not escape their obligation to work. It was closed at night and not opened again until the following morning. It's harder to do this in the village. But when you have a plantation, this is much easier to enforce. And the min-maxing was intense. And Bremen writes it here too. As long as the peasant was still close to their village, they can also grow food crops. Again, you can't subsist on a diet of coffee. You still need rice. You still need all of these food subsistence crops. And so whenever the peasant was still in their village, they could still grow some of these. But once they moved into the plantations, the overseers would not let them do it. Why? Because that should be for coffee. Why are you growing rice? And so I didn't put it here, but Bremen writes how some of the peasants in the plantations were sometimes forced to forage for roots, even just to find enough to eat. And so that was the labor coercion, right? You force the peasants to move up to the plantations. And once they're there, you put them in this pressure cooker environment where you min-max and you hyper-optimize the production of coffee. And again, our old friend monopoly pops up again, right? Because the Dutch, essentially what the system meant was you buy and you acquire coffee at very cheap rates from the Indonesian peasantry, and then you sell them at market prices, which are like, the margins are this big. How do you maintain these prices low? Monopoly. And so they essentially sealed off the Priangan. They monopolized distribution. Other traders who attempted to penetrate the area, the Dutch were very harsh on them. And that And Bremen calls it sort of essentially a police state. And so that was Coulter Stelsel. Sukarno was also aware of this. This is a few excerpts from Indonesia Menggugat. He talks about indigo, but the effect is similar to coffee, right? Again, a crop that cannot be grown in the same region where you're growing rice, your subsistence food. So you have to travel. That's sort of the main idea, right? So again, he writes here about how men from several villages were forced to work the indigo fields, so had to travel all of this distance, and then they worked there. They were away from home for 7 uninterrupted months. So he kept laboring there. And again, all that time they were forced to find their own sustenance. Why? Because again, they don't allow you to grow food crops in the plantations. All the land is to be dedicated to the cash crop. And this is where it gets devastating. When they finally return home, because they've been gone for so long, their paddy fields are already ruined. This was the burden of Coulter Stelsel. This is the burden of geographic dislocation. So Sukarno, when he gets to this part, he starts citing a lot of academics essentially, and Gongrip is the sort of the professor that he cites for this. Another example, this is sort of like how lowly they were compensated. He quotes this from Stofkes, who's another Dutch economist. The coffee farmer receives 4 to 5 cents a day, whereas he requires 30 cents to survive. It's just not sufficient at all. And unsurprisingly, a lot of the locals migrate from the plantations. They run away because this is not sustainable. And that's why they establish a police state, essentially, right? Because again, the Piyangan is empty and no peasant wants to leave their home, go all the way up to the mountains and work under these conditions. So you force them, you create a coercive apparatus that keeps them there. And this is another telling statement. Remember how the Dutch did this? It was through co-opting the elites. How do you get the peasants to move all of this way? You strike a deal with the Bupati. You have a profit-sharing agreement. And then the Bupati's end of the bargain is, guys, you owe me as your sort of like higher up, do this, move here. And that's essentially what he says here. Fear towards the aristocracy has already possessed their souls, their being the peasants, just as these self-same aristocrats have learned to fear their colonial masters. And so again, that's the elite cooptation that we've been talking about many times already throughout this class. It wasn't just labor coercion, though. Coulter Stelsel also had a moral dimension. And to understand this, we're going to turn to this Malaysian professor, Syed Hussein Alatas. 1977, Edward Said sort of publishes his landmark work on post-colonial studies, Orientalism. And he sort of basically argues that the West is sort of has this very distorted and kind of stereotypical view of the Middle East and the East in general, and which he critiques in Orientalism. 1 year before, Syed Hussein Alatas publishes this book, The Myth of the Lazy Native, and basically argues something similar, but in the context of the Malay world, specifically Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines. His arguments are interesting. So again, remember, we live in a post-French Revolution, a post-Enlightenment world. And now you're faced with a dilemma if you're trying to implement something like Coulter Stelsel. You're a good Dutch liberal. You believe in the Enlightenment. People are rational and people are equal and they have a right to liberty and freedom and all of that. So how do you justify forcing them to do things? How do you justify coercion? So Carnot kind of alludes at the answer. He quotes Professor Veff here, that professor. Why was it necessary? Because you need to teach the Javanese how to work. That's the answer. Why do we force them to do this? Well, it's because we believe people are rational, people are smart, but the Javanese are not. They're childlike. They're lazy. We need to force them to work. And that's what, and Alatas is very straightforward about this, right? The system of forced cultivation. He writes that before, when the Dutch first arrived, there were no references to laziness. There were no references at all. But in the moment Coulter Stelsel had to be implemented, negative judgments on Javanese character became more frequent. And again, this is very quite striking. Yet Van den Bosch, the the creator of Kulturstelsel says that the Javanese as a nation are very comparable with Dutch children of 12 to 13 years. So again, they're infants, they're lazy, it's very demeaning. There's just a few more examples to sort of highlight, drive this point home, right? Again, they appeal to history. The Javanese always had to be forced to work. That was sort of what the Dutch thought. We've read Polanyi. We've talked about Polanyi. It's not that they had to be forced to work. They lived by moral economies. They weren't governed by motivations of profit maximization, of accumulation, of like getting richer and richer and richer. That didn't mean they were lazy. They just did not think of work in the same way. But this history was weaponized. Just as the aristocrats have always forced Javanese to work, so do we now force them. And again, same thing. Jay Cyber trying to justify culture stuff. So similar arguments about how they're lazy. You have to sort of compel them to work. Interestingly, I want to turn to this last sort of excerpt. It wasn't just limited to the peasantry. This moral coercion was directed towards the aristocracy as well. It wasn't just the Javanese peasants that were lazy. The aristocrats were also lazy, right? Here, a Javanese chief was banished on the grounds of laziness. The region of Cibagung was punished for sluggishness. And then later, a patih was threatened to be exiled to Batavia the moment he again plays the lazy one. It's a pervasive narrative. So again, Alatas calls this out as bullshit. And he's very striking here. He doesn't talk about the Japanese here. He talks about a British Malaya. But I think you can sort of apply some of the same arguments. It wasn't that the natives weren't lazy. It wasn't that the natives were lazy. They just didn't want to do the kind of work that you wanted to do. Think of the coffee plantations. Think of having to travel all the way from home for 7 months. Think of having to earn all of those cents, those meager cents. Think of being forced to work in that hostile condition under egregious amounts of coercion without being able to grow your own food. Who the hell wants to do that? The natives refused to do that. But some people did in British Malaya. The Chinese and Indian immigrants, because they were immigrants. They were of a much more precarious status. And that's why in British Malaya, the Chinese and the Indians are considered less lazy than the Malays. Because the Malays refused to be a chattel of colonial agrarian capitalism, whereas the Chinese and Indian migrants did not have a choice. So it wasn't that they were lazy. It was because you just didn't want to work in these plantations. That was it. And this quote is, I really like this. And so Alatas quotes this English, a lady observing a bunch of Malays, and this is what she writes. The men are not inclined to much effort except in fishing or hunting, and where they possess rice land and plowing for rice. The women were just lounging about the houses, some cleaning fish, others pounding rice, but they do not care for work. Again, they're lazy, they don't work. And little money which they need for buying clothes they can make by selling nuts or jumbo fruits. And Alatas has this really good rejoinder. What do you mean by work? They're cleaning fish, they're pounding rice, they're making mats, they're selling fruits. Is this not work? Again, it's not that they were lazy per se. It's a very specific and a very loaded definition of work. So that's Alatas. So the Kulturstelsel in retrospect was fabulously successful for the Dutch. The goal was to generate profit, and it generated a lot of profit. We see over the course of 20, 30 years how the value of agricultural produce increased dramatically. And again, notice how coffee is leading the way. Coffee was the most profitable export crop this period. There are other important factors. The profit that Kulturstelsel generated didn't just lie fallow. It didn't just go to the Dutch and like nothing happened. It had a very specific structural goal in Sukarno's thought. And it was that it was necessary for the development of Dutch capitalism itself. And so this is where we start getting and start transitioning into modern imperialism. He writes that, again, if you're a Dutch businessman, you have all sorts of needs. You need to pay off debts, right? You want to liberalize trade. Again, remember, laissez-faire. And then infrastructure, right? You want to construct all these ships and railways. How do you do this at a very cheap cost? Kulturstelsel. You suck out all the profits from a colonial sort of underling, and you use that to fund Dutch capitalism. And again, he's quoting another academic here, and he's very explicit about this, right? All of these good things came to be due to the profits extracted from the Indies. And so that's how we can understand Kulturstelsel. It's sort of a bridge between old and new imperialism. Again, remember last week, Sukarno links new imperialism to the development of modern capitalism. New imperialism is sort of the handmaiden of new imperialism is modern capitalism. And it was systems like Kulturstelsel that allowed capitalism to first develop into that stage. And again, it's worth reading his lines here, right? After modern capitalism has fully developed, again, how? By sucking off the profits of things like Kulturstelsel, then its capital surplus becomes something that many wish to force into Indonesia, and thus is modern imperialism born. Think of it this way, you're a small business, and when you're still starting, you're struggling, you need all the help you can get. You need cheap loans, you need state support, and all sorts of things. And where do you get this money? Well, if you're the Dutch, you get it from stuff like Kulturstelsel and the profits of the VOC. And then you become a giant corporation. And now your goal changes. Your goal isn't looking for the support. Your goal is, maybe I can open a branch in this other country. Maybe I can expand. And this is essentially what Sukarno is talking about. And so old imperialism was sort of an incubation period in his line of argument for Dutch capital. But it wasn't just Dutch capital that was being prepared by old imperialism. It was Indonesia itself. It was the Indies itself. Remember, why did Raffles fail? You did not have market society. Kulturstelsel began to transform, began to plant the seeds for market society in the Indies. And why is that important? Because what is the hallmark of new imperialism? Narvrijheid, liberalization, Narvrijdarbeid, free business. Unshackle capital. Let it roam free. Let it run wild in this market that we've created. You couldn't do that during Raffles' time, but you can damn well do it now. And that's what happened. Again, same thing. So another line from Sukarno, I'm sort of running short of time, so I'm going to skip it. I'm just going to highlight the key points here. Again, what's the main element of, and sort of, this is the liberal period we're talking about, 1870 to 1942, where Kulturstelsel was basically dismantled. So no more forced system, and now you have essentially a free market, hence the word liberal. Now it's no longer the state that's taking the reins. And remember, in Kulturstelsel, it was the state, it was the colonial government that stepped in and basically said, okay, we have these plantations, we have these like forced sort of quotas. In the liberal period, it's no longer the state, it's private capital. And then they come in, and Sukarno has this very illustrative sort of picture, right? They establish sugar factories, tea plantations, tobacco enterprises everywhere, right? And old imperialism grew weaker and weaker, and new imperialism takes its place. It's the same wealth extraction, just different font. But again, it's centered on private capital. It's not the government, it's private capital. Notice also the new industrial heterogeneity, right? We were talking about coffee, sugar, and indigo. Now you have railways, now you have tobacco. It's a much vaster industrial field. And Max Havelaar, which is sort of like the counterattack against Kulturstelsel and sort of heralded in the liberal period, is part of this movement. It's Multatuli's book. I talked about it a few weeks ago when we were going into Minka on Pramudia Nantatur. And I want to highlight in a few ways, to summarize, I guess, how this was different. We've already seen how, again, the liberal part was different. The role of private capital instead of the government is also different. it was also different in the sense that modern capitalism was not the same anymore in the late 19th century as it was in the 1830s. Now it became much more industrial in character. Again, think about the Industrial Revolution. Think about the development of steel factories, of railways, of ships and harbors. It was a very important invention in 1885, it's the automobile. And this created new demand for new commodities. And what if you're a car maker, what are the things that are important to you? Well, steel is important, but also two new commodities, oil and rubber. Oil for the internal combustion engine, rubber for the tires. And these became the two new major export goods of Indonesia. No longer coffee, no longer sugar, but oil and rubber. And another big shift was that, again, coffee and sugar were agricultural cash crops. So they were focused on Java, which was sort of the agricultural powerhouse of Indonesia. With rubber and oil, the focus shifted to the outer islands, especially Sumatra. And it wasn't just the Dutch anymore doing this. It was all sorts of other private companies from other European countries. For example, I think Royal Shell, the sort of the oil company, that's a merger of a Dutch and British corporation. And so again, it's much more metropolitan at this point. And Sukarno sort of highlights here what he calls the four Shaktis, the four pillars of modern imperialism. First, Indonesia. So, okay, the coffee and sugar part, that's still there. It still supplies all of these basic subsistence goods. But now it also becomes a source for raw industrial materials, oil and rubber. And eventually, today it's mineral ores, I guess, and palm oil. Thirdly, again, remember, capital, once developed, looks for a market, right? It looks for new grounds for investment. That's point 3 and point 4. Indonesia becomes a market for the sale of all sorts of products from foreign industry, and also becomes a business area. It becomes an investment field for all of these businesses. So it should sound quite familiar to anyone listening to development debates in Indonesia today. It gets even more deja vu as we go on. Again, let's go back to Polanyi, right? Polanyi and laissez-faire was planned. That's the deep irony of a laissez-faire system. It's the sort of the underlying principle is leave people to do what they want. Leave people to do what they want. But to have a laissez-faire system, you have to plan things. You have to establish a certain groundwork. Market society does not arise organically. That's why Raffles failed. You have to create fertile grounds first before this can emerge. And Sukarno is very attuned to this. He outlines certain administrative sort of building blocks that have to be in place first before this liberal policy could succeed. The first was the Agrarian Act of 1870. Again, Raffles already sort of went in this direction when he said, like, okay, you're all just leasing land from the government. The Dutch go even further. They say all of the land that's unowned in the Indies belongs to us, to the government, and we're going to lease it out. So that's one pillar. That, remember, we talk about empty lands. We talk about how land was like an ample resource. You're sort of like, someone forces you to go on a plantation. Oh, I'll just move there. Well, you can't do that anymore because, oh, that's owned by the government now. Not mine. I can't do that anymore. Point 1. Point 2, regulations with regards to labor. Especially important here was the Ponel Sancti, which now you have a legal framework to enforce labor contracts. This is particularly important for plantations because, again, these brutal conditions, what are you going to do? You're going to run. And now you get to punish people who do that. You have legal blessing to do that. Law and order. Remember our example on African tribes, right? About how warfare is bad for business. The Dutch, part of it was the pressure of imperial and great power competition, but another element of why the Dutch expanded so spectacularly in Indonesia in this period was to quash indigenous powers that would disrupt business. And Sukarno gives very specific examples: Bone, Aceh, Bali. A lot of like the surviving, the holdovers of local kingdoms and powers in this time. Again, even education for producing labor, and he uses the word halus, that's more obedient. And finally, criminal law code that bans labor strike. So again, you have to lay the groundwork for laissez-faire. You can't just say, I want laissez-faire, as Raffles did. You have to sort of go through all of this. And so again, all these statistics are from Sukarno, from Indonesia Menggugat. Again, spectacularly profitable for the Dutch. This is again, we talked about the land, Erfpak land that sort of like was owned by the government, is exploded over the course of the 20th century. Export surplus, same thing, exploded. Again, it's very profitable. We have some statistics here. So the dividends of certain companies, 35% for Sumatra tobacco, 170% for Cinchona. Cinchona is an interesting crop. It's sort of it's a tree, and the bark is used to synthesize anti-malarial drugs. And that's very relevant for us because if you're colonizing the tropics and you're European, malaria is an enemy, and you have to deal with it. And so, okay, now you need cinchona, you need anti-malarial drugs. And the more you need cinchona because of colonialism, and then cinchona drives more colonialism. So it's sort of like this interesting cycle. And another one is that a third, Sukarno was drawing some statistics, and he showed that a third of the Dutch wealth came from the East Indies at the time. That was how major, again, like the Netherlands is a very tiny, tiny country. The East Indies is much bigger than the actual, and and more so over time. But so are we. So I don't know if that's something. So yeah, again, it was very good for the Dutch. So let's summarize a bit what we've been talking about over the past 2 weeks, right? We see this almost molecular rearrangement of Indonesian society, right? The VOC comes in, they sort of disrupt things, they lay the groundwork for the Dutch East Indies, and then by forming trade monopolies. And again, the focus was just on acquiring, for the most part, spices and like exotic goods, but that evolved over time. When the Dutch government comes in and takes control, they realize I have to re-engineer society to actually produce all of these goods that we want, the coffee, the sugar. And again, think about Polanyi, right? This isn't something that has to be sort of imposed. This is not something that necessarily arises organically. And at the same time, this sort of like allowed Dutch capital to develop and incubate. And once it did, you have the liberal period, which Sukarno calls new imperialism. It matures, it forces its way into Indonesia. And now the focus, and now we have a more sophisticated economy. It's more industrial than it was before. And so that's sort of a summary of what we've been talking about over the past 2 weeks. Let's start to end the session by sort of talking more about the implications, right? Because Sukarno, he's been spending 50, 60 pages critiquing and analyzing the Dutch economic system. And now he's like, why does he do that? We know what he's leading up to. He's leading up to sort of like, this is why we need to be independent. So let's start getting there slowly. On the surface, and this is essentially what the sympathizers of the system would say, Indonesians shouldn't be complaining. We come in, we build railroads, we develop all of these things, we brought progress. Why are you complaining? And this is even, you can even be a bit more sort of jingoistic about this during the liberal period. Because in Voltaire Stelzer, you're like, but you forced us to work. In the liberal period, it's like, we didn't force anything. We just let businesses come in. We're not coercing anyone. Why are you complaining? There's also this sort of like nostalgia that sometimes comes these days about how like we were better off under the Dutch. The Dutch built stuff. We don't build stuff anymore. So why are we complaining? And turns out Sukarno has a very direct answer to that. He writes, yes, it does bring about civilization, brings about peace and calm. It brings all of these roads, all of this infrastructure. But when you actually look at the social life of actual Indonesians, these have been disastrous. You can look at the statistics, you can look at the shiny railways, you can look at all of this. If you look at the actual social and daily life of all the Indonesians, it's disastrous. What is this disaster that he's talking about? He links it again. He links it to the fact that this infrastructure does nothing but ease the movement of private capital, right? It facilitates capital's wild movements across its various fields of enterprise, growing and self-multiplying everywhere until the livelihoods of our people are left in utter shambles. So again, This infrastructure isn't meant for Indonesians. It's meant to facilitate private capital. Now, you might say, well, that's still a good thing, right? Railways are still a good thing. And Sukarno here, he quotes Karl Kautsky, who was a leader of the European labor movement, and he says, and Karl Kautsky says, agrees, it can be a good thing. The improvement of these means of communication and production can truly be a means of expanding the productive capacities of economically backward countries. It can be good for us. Having railways, having better factories can be good for Indonesians, can improve our economic lives if it's used for them. It's not. What are they used for? Ballooning military budgets and foreign debts. The surplus, the economic gains that are arising out of the Indies, they're funding Dutch military conquests. They're funding Dutch foreign debts. They're not being reinvested, so to speak, in Indonesia. And that's why the livelihoods of our people are left in utter shambles. It can be powerful. We see how in capitalist countries, you see a rise in the standard of living based on these things. So it is possible. That's what Kautsky is saying. It's just we're not directing it there in Indonesia. Everything is going to the Netherlands. None of it stays in Indonesia. He gets more explicit about this as we sort of advance through his argument. He talks about how, aside from the aristocracy and the civil servants, again, these are the classes that are somewhat co-opted by the government, for ordinary Javanese, you don't actually see much of an improvement in their daily lives. They're just worried about, you have enough to eat today? You have enough to eat tomorrow? And his evocative terms in Indonesian is, hidupnya sekarang makan, besok tidak. And again, this sort of, again, this is a callback to the indigo, to the coffee example. He's quoting Schmalhausen, who's another academic. I've seen with my own eyes how women, after hours of walking, arrive at their destination only to realize that they cannot partake in the harvesting of crops due to an oversupply of workers. Not a few collapse by the roadside, sobbing in despair. And all of this for a measly 9 cents, working hard labor in the scorching sun. If you're an aristocrat, if you're a civil servant, you don't go through this. But the vast majority of the Indonesian peasantry, this is what they go through in Sukarno's sort of estimation. On a broader level, essentially, Sukarno argues that Indonesia is transformed into a labor reserve force. Indonesia becomes a sink for cheap labor, right? It's a transform into a nation of mere proletarians. And all the nations of the world, you want your coffee, you want your sugar, you want your rubber. How do you produce them most cheaply? Indonesia. Why? Cheap labor. And he writes here how it's not even just a minimum wage, it's a do not die of hunger wage. Upah yang sekadar supaya jangan sampai mati kelaparan, right? For the bare minimum of survival. And again, why is this happening? Call back to what you were saying previously. It's never meant for Indonesians. It's never meant for the native inhabitants, for the Indies. All of the proceeds for this were meant for the Dutch, for the Europeans. All the Indonesians get are scraps. And again, go back to what we were saying about the liberal. Again, these debates about like, we brought you progress, we brought you development. Sukarno says, no, we don't get any of that. For example, hygiene and health. We don't even get that. We only have 343 hospitals. The death rate is never less than 20%. We don't have hygiene and health. Labor protections? No. No regulations. We can't even hold strikes. There's no labor protections. Freedom of the press, the right to organize and protest, freedom of speech, right? The Enlightenment. The Dutch brought Indonesians freedom. Do Indonesians have freedom? They don't. Pendigulan. So again, remember, we were talking about Bovendigul, the concentration camp in Papua a few weeks ago. Pendigulan basically refers to like how like certain natives would just be sent to Bovendigul. It gives the government and president or authority over every movement and person that it does not like. Do these rights exist where the reports of spies or even just an anonymous letter is enough to justify raids, locking up dozens of leaders in jail and throwing them out into the world of exile? We have none of these. All of these rights, all of these fruits of the Enlightenment, all of these fruits of progress, of development that you cite all the time, we don't have any of them. So what does that mean if you're an Indonesian? And we'll end here. And sort of this is a kind of a nice bridge for next week. Nothing, we don't get anything from you guys. You don't get anything from the Dutch. None of the benefits you say outweigh all of the disasters that have befallen us. And you can see sort of how he sort of moves. The people, our people, my people, right? We're kind of screwed under you. We get nothing from it. We get absolutely nothing. And so sort of we can already see where this is going, right? If we get nothing from you, all we can do is break away from you. You're giving us absolutely nothing. And that's where we'll pick up next week. We'll move into the final third act of Indonesia Menggugat, where Sukarno outlines his vision of independence and sort of this idea of a distinct Indonesian state, a distinct Indonesian identity. Okay, sorry for going really over the limit today. Thanks for tuning in. Okay, Q&A, discussion. Anyone wants to mention, bring up something?
I have a comment and
Mhm.
a few questions.
Yeah.
First is, I really appreciate how you talked about market economy as not something that's
Mhm.
organic. Do you know that I think what's his name? David Foster Wallace once had said like, what is water in the perspective of fish?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I was thinking. I was like, I live
Yeah.
in a market economy. It makes sense that things be commodified because I'm like a fish in water. I don't know what water is. It's just all around me. And to kind of learn that I actually have to be brought over. And so one of my questions is, did Indonesia have currency before the VOC came?
Mhm.
Because if there is currency and money, doesn't that naturally lead to commodification of things because it's convenient?
Yeah, so I just want to repeat it over Zoom. Like, that's such a great metaphor, like this, being a fish out of water. I wish I said that. And yeah, there's a really good example. A friend of mine, I don't know how honest he was being, but let's assume he was. He was trying to describe how in traditional markets in Indonesia, prices would fluctuate wildly up and down. And he says that's essentially a function of a lot of the merchants were essentially like transplants from the regions learning how markets work. So how would it work? For example, you sell a cup, and then it costs you 5,000 rupiah to make the cup. And then that's how you sell it. You sell it for that much. And then you see a competitor selling it for 10,000. You're like, wait, I can actually raise the price. He sets it to 50,000. Now, if you knew how markets work, you'd never do that because the guy selling it at 10,000 is going to undercut you. But that's sort of what he was getting at, sort of just learning process. But back to your actual question about currency, yes, it did exist. And there was for a while there was actually competition for different currencies in the VOC period. Like there were Spanish reals, there were Dutch sort of minted guilders, were the guilders at the time. Yeah, and also like local currencies as well. In fact, like one of the things that the VOC tried to do was to establish a monopoly on minting, on like establishing a legal tender. But it never fully penetrated the interior, this monetary economy. It was definitely quite prevalent in the coastal communities in the Pasisir. It made its way even to the Mataram court inland, but for a lot of like villages, a money economy was still quite remote. There's an interesting, until this day, something that still applies. There's this George Quinn. He had this book about Javan. It's called The Bandit Saints of Java, and it talks about sort of like the acculturation between Javanese mysticism and Islam. And one of the things he pointed out was that a lot of Javanese, like monsters, are often like a reflection of their culture's deepest fears. So, for example, like monsters in 19th century Europe were like werewolves and vampires, sort of reflected fears of hygiene, which is like very, I guess, a very dirty era. Whereas a lot of Japanese monsters reflect a fear of money. Like I think the example he used was Tuyul. Sort of like this like baby who like sort of like who steals, and you kind of like establish a Faustian bargain with like so I think in that sense it still feels like it sometimes still feels like an alien, like very slippery concept.
And then my second comment was, like when like the carrot on the stick, right? Proper, make promise, Stanford Rapids.
Yeah.
And well, I'm wondering if maybe in the interior, there was no meaningful outlet for the accumulation of money, right? Like if you're in a European city, you have opera houses, you go eat fancy food, buy spices, but why would they need to accumulate money if they have that, right? Land has not been commodified. They work to get food. What else are they going to accumulate money for? So I was wondering if that also played a part, and that when the Dutch came in and industrialized, like liberal era, you're creating outlets for capital. Indonesians now want to work.
Yeah. It's sort of no, that's a really good point. And there's sort of even this debate, sometimes in the historiography, where there's one side that takes a very Polanyian line and basically argues that, okay, because of the moral economy stuff, this was just fundamentally like, you can't, they had to force this on the Japanese. There's also another school of thought that argues that it could have still worked. It was just that the Japanese weren't compensated enough. Again, remember, we showed how they were paid pennies essentially. And so that's sort of part of the debate in the sort of the scholarship. But no, I think that's an interesting point that you raised. So Sharon, okay. Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Can you hear me now?
I'm just thinking when you describe how they were usually kind of in like animals in the populations and that pushing of the production increase therefore actually more and more people. And that you have to find your own people provided or existing like provided, and then they would come home after months and months, and all of their cultures were pretty much dead if whoever was left back can maintain them. How does that not, or did it create mass starvation? Because it makes me think of China, for example, when you force people like that to work in an agrarian way and you don't produce enough food, or you don't feed them at least, how does that not create a sort of slap back in the face of the people who you want to extract all this from are dying, cannot feed their children will not either be born or survive, so how do they simply keep existing? That's why I say it's a silly question, but how many people or how far did the extent of starvation reach, I guess is my question.
Well, I think absolutely that there are schools of thought that basically argue that there was an explosion in both famines and peasant revolts in this period. And the famines part is exactly like you said. It created these localized shortages of basically rice. Amartya Sen makes a very similar argument. Marx also makes a similar argument. He traces basically the Bengal famine to the fact that a lot of the rice growing lands, or a lot of the subsistence crop growing lands in Bengal was converted to cotton production, and that created this like localized famine. And something similar, some argue that something similar happened in Java. And the increase in revolt sort of tracks with that, right? Sort of peasant uprising, which sort of created this vicious cycle of like, okay, the more this is clearly hurting people, and so they're revolting, and so there's famines, and that sort of necessitates a firmer hand. And that's part of the reason why the Dutch became increasingly repressive. As to your other point, which is it's a good point. Like, why didn't people die off? It's interesting because actually, I think I have the chart. What you see is actually population growth. It's fascinating. I've tried looking up the literature as to like what was driving this, and there's still not any conclusive answer.
Right. So was it that they would take people from other parts of, now Indonesia, were they just kind of moving around, and then the numbers look as if the population increased?
Well, this one's for Indonesia and total.
Earlier, that it was dense, and now you're saying it was growing. So I don't know. Maybe it's just that like proportional to the entire population, these plantations were not
Yeah.
enough to create significant damage, but it's just like
Yeah.
that kind of abuse, you would think
Yeah.
you'd see a dent.
Right. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure why it didn't. There's actually some arguments that say that the Coulter stencil had a positive effect on population growth because it created an incentive for Javanese families to have more kids, essentially, for like to provide labor, right? If like, and so I'm trying to think, what's the best frame of reference? Maybe, okay, think of say a Marxist frame of reference, right? Where because land is now scarce because of all of these things, the governments own them. The peasant is separated from his means of production. So now you're dependent on wage labor, right? It's very different if you have your own land, you can do whatever you want. But if you don't have land, if you're a landless peasant, you're dependent on someone else to provide you your means of living. And even if the wage labor is nil, you still need it. And so you sort of, it's this very cruel logic. And it's like, you think about having a lot of kids to get a lot of wage labor, but you don't necessarily think if they're all in um, kind of. And the other big thing, I should have mentioned this from the beginning, developments in healthcare. I think it was like the vaccines were also being distributed. I think was it typhoid or something, but that also like played a very big role in the explosion of population. And Sukarno himself says that like, oh yeah, modern imperialism brought this explosion in population. Yeah, precisely. Yeah. Oh, okay. Let me. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, as usual, once I turn on the speaker, it's gonna echo. So I'm gonna turn it on, and you can speak, Sharon. 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay. I just want to answer that question about this population exploding. I read somewhere it's because also gynecology, so reproduction healthcare, they bring
Wait.
like
Sorry, Sharon. Could you repeat your question? Yeah.
okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to answer that population explosion thing. Why the population explode is because of gynecology, like reproduction healthcare. At that time, it was like invented basically like because of the Enlightenment movement. So now there is a gynecologist and reproduction healthcare, so baby can survive. So this is why we have like population boom during the late 1800s. But my question is actually about what about religion at that time, like during this market economy, like the creation of market economy in Java? Because what I learned during my like media studies is like the reason why uh, this enlightenment is so popular in Europe is because like they also have revolution in religion, right? Like from Catholic to Protestant, like there's a reform in Christian itself. So that I'm wondering like uh, Christianity. I mean, so I'm wondering like during this market economy creation was what is the major like religion in Java? And because like nowadays like the majority of Indonesian is still Muslim, but somehow I mean like maybe it's like what is the justification for the Dutch to create this market economy if they don't bring their religion to Indonesia, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
Thank you. Maybe you can add a few more.
I want the part where you asked about what's the justification of the Dutch to bring market economy if not because of religion. I don't understand that part.
Did you hear that, Sharon?
no, it's so
Sorry, can you elaborate more on the last part, what you were saying on what's the justification of bringing market economy if not because of religion?
yeah, because like the Enlightenment is popular in Europe hand in hand with the kind of like reform in religious beliefs too, like because like in Europe before there was like Vikings as well. They also have like moral economy before they have like the Romans, but then they basically what I'm saying, like the European, they did this creation of market economy society to themselves first, and the justification for that is the religious revolution, But in Indonesia, I was wondering what was the major religion at the time in Java for the Dutch to actually like create this market society thing, or it just doesn't happen for some reason.
Maybe I can. Oh, sorry. Uh, the disclaimer is I haven't like delved too deeply into the literature of religion in this period, but I can make a few comments. Merle Ricklefs has this 3-volume series on the history of Islam in Java. He goes from the sort of the mystic synthesis before the Dutch comes in, and then the next book's on the Dutch period, and third's on modern Indonesia. I haven't read the second book, which is what this argument is going to be based on, but essentially Ricklef argues that Alcia might give me crap for this, but the distinction between santri and abangan, which is between Muslims Javanese who are more orthodox pious Muslims, and those who are sort of adhere more closely to Kejawen or like pre-Islamic beliefs, or a more syncretic version of Islam, abangan. This division appeared during this period, the Dutch East Indies. And it was linked to kind of a social division of labor, where a lot of the abangan were Javanese peasants who were subjected to sort of like the labor coercion of kulturstelsel, whereas a lot of the santri are essentially like pious Muslims who resided in the coastal cities, in the Pasisir Utara. What does that mean? They're better positioned to access trade. And so they actually became sort of the genesis of an emerging Javanese Muslim merchant class. And that created a very distinct a very distinct version of Islam than the Islam that was practiced by the Abangan. And again, one hint is that, again, say you're a santri, you're sort of a Javanese Muslim, you're a trader in Jepara or Rembang, and then you're getting rich, you're sort of capitalizing on these mercantile opportunities. What does that mean? You can go on the Hajj. And maybe you go on the Hajj, you're exposed to more orthodox versions of Islam. You're like, oh, why is the version in Java so different? And maybe that sort of drives the distinction between the two groups. Yes, I don't know if that answered the question. That's sort of is there anything else you want to add, Sharon? I'm gonna turn on the speaker if you want to say anything else.
Yeah, because I'm just wondering why was there no like religious resistance during this creation of market economy? Because this is what leads to war in Europe, right? Because the Catholic, they don't like this Calvinist market economy, So I'm just wondering.
Yeah, absolutely. There was Sartono Kartodirjo. He's writing on peasant revolts in Java. He writes that essentially, like a lot of these revolts, even if their root causes were not necessarily, I might be butchering it, I haven't finished it. Maybe Brian can correct me if he's in the group. He did his thesis on Sartono. Even if the underlying cause of the revolt wasn't necessarily religious, it was often expressed in a religious way. And it was often led by local religious figures like Kiais. And so I would say, yes, there was plenty of protest. I would even say there's still plenty of protest today. There's like, someone was telling me that if you want to say build something in NTT, Nusa Tenggara Timur, one of the provinces in Indonesia, the best way to get a land permit is to offer to build them a mosque or a church. So it's still very much this moral economy element that you sort of describe is still very much prevalent in Indonesia today. Yeah.
The argument was fantastic. Thank you. And also, I just want to point out that it's so ironic and that a lot of that knowledge of gynecology that the Westerners apparently brought was stolen a lot from Africa and other colonies and native, non-European people. So I just think that's a nice, not nice circle, but still glad we have the knowledge now.
Yes, thank you for that. Do you want to add anything else, Sharon? I'm gonna turn on speaker again.
No, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
That Artanti was saying is interesting because he was mentioning how most populations.
Traditional reformist and traditional Islam and reformist Islam didn't appear until the early 20th century, which is correct because because I haven't read much on the topic, but I think you're right, Derek, in the sense that wait, I'm blanking on English.
English,
Bentar.
you can.
Oh, wait, I want to say something.
It's about shoot. Ya jadi lupa aku maaf. Maaf banget, I'm so sorry guys, I'm blanking.
It's okay. It's okay.
Blanking
It's
on
okay.
the
This is a. Mhm.
For the question that was asked.
Yeah,
by
yeah.
Clara, about if cultural carousel happens in Indonesia, like we are made to grow coffee, why didn't we have this something the same that happened in China, which is the kelaparan massal? I think it's because we have this creativity from the Japanese. I mean, I'm Japanese myself, so I know the story. So at the time, a surplus of sugar happened because everyone grow apa ya?
Sugarcane.
Sugarcane. So sugar is everywhere. But the rice is like not depleted. So what they do is like they create a jajanan pasar like timbul, maybe like kopong. So they make this food out of sugar. So they create another food as substitute to the main food. So not healthy, but they create that. Kelaparan masih terjadi, kematian ada, tapi tidak semasif yang ada di China. So I think that's what happened in Indonesia, in Java, tempat terjadinya perpustakaan sama saya.
Yeah. Hopefully we can highlight this in the next class, but it's sort of like exactly what you were saying. Like so far we've been talking about the Dutch point of view a lot and sort of like these poor Japanese souls. There was a lot of they found ways to go around the system, and hopefully we can get into that a bit more in the next few classes. Yeah. Okay. I think let's call it quits. Okay, thank you everyone. We'll see you all next week when we sort of wrap up with Indonesia Menggugat.